May my song feed the earth. I believe that I belong to the earth. I belong. May my life be a song. May my song feed the earth.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I've had about 6 different titles for this, so I think there's a different title on YouTube and a different title on, excuse me, I'm sorry. And the reason I have this, I have some different ideas about improv. It just suddenly came to me a couple of months ago that improv has been, we've been doing improv ourselves for a very long time, and not just for fun. I tell a story that happened to me in Vietnam on the very first mission. When you first go someplace, they have you fly around in circles and demonstrate that you know how to fly and can do emergencies and things like that. And then you get to go out for real. Usually you go out for real on what we call dash and trash, which just means that you're dropping off food and supplies and then taking trash away somewhere to be burned, those sorts of things. On my very first mission, it was a night mission, and when I got into the helicopter, just to let you know what was going on, I got into the helicopter, I pulled out a map, and the aircraft commander said, "You don't need a map, you'll see where we're going." And I thought, oh dear. I hadn't been in a briefing, you see, and he had. Basically, there was a big fight going on, and we were going to provide ammunition for somebody, so all we had to do was go to the light, not literally, or not well, anyway, we had to go where there was other kinds of light. We got there, and he asked me to fly, which I just thought was just stupid, to have this teenager barely out of flight school to fly this helicopter where all those fireworks were going on, and I flew. And when we got there, I was ready for him to take over the controls. He got his hands up there by his controls, and I thought he was getting ready to take over, so I just kind of relaxed, and the helicopter wobbled, and he said, "You're flying." I said, "Oh dear." And then I remembered why his hands were there. It was just in case I couldn't fly anymore. So that made me even more nervous than all the fireworks that were going on. There were people there that didn't want me to be there, and so they made every effort they could to make sure I didn't stay there. And the aircraft suddenly started moving back and forth, and whenever I pushed my pedals, nothing happened. So I understood then that they had hit something around the tail rotor, and I made a decision to make a turn towards a clearing. That's when he put his hands on the controls and took over, and he said, "I've got it." And when the aircraft just wobbled all over the place, but he flew it all the way back, and he actually landed it in one single spot rather than running in like we usually did. It was a very strange situation for me, but I was alive, and so it wasn't that strange. And the next day, I asked him to demonstrate and help me understand what he did. I said, "How did you know to do that?" And he said, "I didn't." I said, "How did you know to fly the helicopter sideways?" He said, "Well, first of all, helicopters don't know what direction they're flying. This thing you're sitting in has a direction, but the helicopter doesn't really have that, and you can fly it sideways, backward, you can do all these things." So I said, "Okay, I get that." And then I said, "But help me understand." And he said, "I just did what the helicopter needed me to do to keep flying." And then he said, and I said, "How do you know when to quit?" And he said, "You fly as long as you can." And I said, "Really? How do you know?" And he said, "There's always something left to do until there isn't." Now that story sounded really stupid to 20-year-old me. But over the years, that story's come back over and over and over. There's always something left to do until there isn't. And I missed maybe the most important thing that I was being told, and that is that flying helicopters in a way is improvisation. When something starts to break on the helicopter or something is broken, you keep doing the next thing the helicopter needs you to do. So, that gave me the idea recently, after reading Bossy Pants. Anybody read that? Tina Fey has these 4 ideas about improvisation. So I said, boy, that's the idea. But before I could get a chance to make a talk about Tina Fey, I did a talk. I noticed something by Charlie Parker, and we'll get to that in just a minute. These are our unity principles. You guys probably all heard about them on many occasions. I want to call your attention to number 5, and it says, through thoughts, words, and actions, we live the truth that we know. And that was said in another way by Connie Fillmore. Perhaps it was said in a fashion that was a little too hardcore. Because she said, knowing and understanding the laws of life, also called truth, is not enough. In other words, she's saying, we come to unity to get this positive, practical spirituality. And she's saying, letting us know that what we know doesn't make any difference. Whether we know how to pray and do the whole 5-step prayer process, all the things we can learn in our classes, unless we put it into practice, our life will change very little. It'll change very little. So I agree with her. We've got to put this into practice. And I'll remind you that our Buddhist friends, when they talk about sitting in a meditation room, they call that practice. When they're sitting in their car, they call that practice. When they're in a fuss with their spouse, they call that practice. So I kind of think we should become unity practitioners rather than just truth students. So you can see the 3rd and the 5th kind of go together. It says we're co-creators, and we do all of the things that we can do through thoughts that are held in mind, and then through thoughts, words, and actions, we live the truth that we know. So how on earth do we do that? How do we become practitioners? How do we practice what we learn in here on Sundays and what we learn in other classes that we take? Charlie Parker had an idea about how to do that. What he does in music is he says you learn your instrument. And then you learn music. That's music theory and all those things. And guess where the theory is in unity? It's all right here. This is all theory. Anytime Reverend Gary says something, anytime I say something, I'm giving you something that is a theory that perhaps has been proven by a lot of people. But until you take it as your own, you're not able to use it. So Charlie said, first learn your instrument, second learn the music, and then you get on stage and forget all that and play. That's what that pilot did that allowed me to be here today. He forgot all the rules except one. Fly the plane. Fly it. Do what it needs to do to stay in the air. So what's your instrument? It's your brain. It's your mind. We are called one of the mind religions because we have important things to say about your mind. We talk about thoughts held in mind, produce after their own kind. We also have this idea brought to us by our Unity co-founder Charles Fillmore that our mind is connected to divine mind. And divine mind is something that is across the universe, across wherever anything is. divine mind is. So this is how it looks. I'm going to ask you to imagine, I think I've talked about this before, but when I was here before, but I want to ask you to consider that idea of your conscious. Now, those of you who are psychologists, I ask you to ignore this from the perspective of psychology because this is from Charles Fillmore. And remember, he was educated by a neighbor. He didn't even get to be homeschooled. He was taught by a neighbor everything that he knew until he started teaching himself. But if you imagine all those words written on a piece of paper and you roll that paper into a tube and tape it together, you will notice then that the conscious mind is connected to the subconscious and the superconscious. Superconscious is God mind. And the conscious mind is connected or can be connected to that God mind. We also can get information from God mind from our subconscious. Now, how do we do that? One of those ways that we do that is with our conscious mind, is we try to control that conscious mind. One of the ways we do that is through denials and affirmations. You guys have probably heard about that. That's where we deny the power of one thing and we affirm the power of God in our lives, or affirm other powers in our lives. And so we deny one thing and we affirm others. That's one of the ways we do that. Now, there are other ways that we can get our conscious mind connected to God mind, and that happens when we meditate. Now, there are some kinds of meditation that the goal of that meditation isn't to connect to God mind. Some of us just want to calm down. And that's an admirable goal, but that goal then of that 10, 15, 20 minutes you spend there is not a goal to connect to God. Connie Fillmore, granddaughter of Charles Fillmore, said that he would be sitting in the living room and then his head would just drop back and he would go into the silence. She had to explain to her friends that he wasn't dead because it kind of appeared that he was dead. He just laid back. And so there are a lot of ways we can do this, and I'll talk in a minute about some of the things that we can do. But what we're really seeing there, and this is, you'll find this in Keep It True Lent, a book by Charles Fillmore, is that conscious mind is like a swinging door between the God mind and between our subconscious. And the subconscious is just another word for memory. Now, it also can be not necessarily things that you remember that really happened, because memory doesn't always work that way. It can be dreams. So from that subconscious mind, we may get information from dreams. Well, that comes into our conscious mind. Some people believe that our dreams are the way that God mind is giving that information to the conscious mind, because as we sleep, that information comes into a space where you can then access it from your conscious mind. Now, if you're adequately confused, we'll move on. So, when we think about where the music is, and that's these rooms that we come to, it can be here at the church, it can be reading books or other things that we do to learn about how other folks use their mind. Learn how other people, or ideas that other people have about practical spirituality, practical Christianity, whatever term we're going to use. We go out and we read, we listen to people, and we learn some things, but until we put them into practice, nothing happens. So what do you do when you're on 1604 or 35? I just thought about 1604 because that's where it always happens to me. But say you're on 35 and you look into your rearview mirror. Now, most of you already know what you do. You got some choices. you got some choices. One of them is to slow down, so in case a vehicle in front of you has a problem, you have room to stop. Now, of course, that may make that person right behind you a little more angry than they are because they're having to slow down behind you, but it keeps you safe. And so as you pay attention to your safety, that's a practical way to look at that. Another thing you can do is change lanes. I had a hard time finding a picture that was about changing lanes, so that's why we have that. So as we change lanes, we move over and let somebody pass us. Now, the reason I pay attention to traffic is one of the easiest ways for me to gauge where I am spiritually. If I can drive here and not say a bad word about anybody on the road, I'm doing pretty good. And I think that I'm in a pretty spiritual place. And I can tell you, sometimes when I come here, I don't do so well. Because it's very challenging to have people put your life at risk. That truck right behind you is putting your life at risk. But what is it that some of us do to let that truck know he's putting my life at risk? We put our life at more risk. He needs to know. He needs to know that he's putting my life at risk. And so we step on the brakes. Or we more than step on the brakes. Had this conversation recently with my wife. She said, well, they just need to know. So I asked the question, are you trying to teach them how to drive? And she said, no, which is the answer. But it's a choice that we make. And so those of you who immediately knew what you were going to do, I'm not saying any of this is good and bad. It's just that you likely put yourself into more danger and other people into potential danger. And it's choices. That's what we do all day. But when we get into this practice place, what we've got to do is to learn a practice of self-observation. Now, I teach mindfulness meditation. And when we talk about something called feeling tones. We don't talk about the feelings because you get into, this may sound pretty negative about men, but men tend to have a very small number of recognizable emotions. When you ask a man what's going on, I'm good. I'm good. And I'm good can mean a whole lot of things. It can mean a whole lot of things, but it just means what? I'm not mad. Because the other one is anger. Men have, I'm good, I'm angry. Now, men can possibly, I speak from a personal experience, it's possible to say, I'm good, and have that mean I'm mad, and then things go out of control from that. But the point of that is we don't talk about that. In mindfulness, we don't want to say, when you're sitting and you're being mindful, that you notice that you're angry. You notice that a feeling is negative. You notice that a feeling is positive. Not that it is good, bad, or specifically defining that. So in terms of this self-observation, we want those feelings to just be positive, neutral, or negative. We'll practice that here in a little bit. And then we want to keep an eye on or observe our behaviors. So when you're having negative emotions, how do you behave? And how many of those negative emotions lead to behaviors that lead to more negative emotions? And so when we go into our practical place, we have this automatic system that Charles Fillmore calls our personality. The Greeks called it persona. And that is this way that you show up in the world, the way you interact in the world, based upon what you think you learned as a kid. And the reason I say it's what you think you learned as a kid, because so often what you think you learned as a kid, or what you say you learned as a kid, was not spoken out loud. Now, sometimes it is. You know, my wife talks about her dad saying, don't worry about it. Girls aren't good at math. Girls aren't good at math, which was a direct teaching from her father that she wasn't good at math or didn't need to be good at math. Now, my father would have just covered all that up by saying, don't worry about it, you're pretty, you'll get married. Oh, dear. So that was a way that people are taught. People are taught by what they hear, and we put all that on. My wife stayed married 17 years to a man she abhorred. Why did she change? Her father died. As soon as her father died, she filed for divorce. So when you observe her behaviors, she observes her behaviors, she notices that she made decision after decision after decision that was based on a lie. That was based on a lie. So when we look at why do I need to teach that truck driver a lesson, that's coming from this automatic reaction that you haven't thought through. You haven't thought it all the way, you haven't thought it through. It's just your personality showing up. Now, personality is not how that God self shows up, that part of you that has God, that is connected to God mind. That's not it. Personality is something entirely different. It's what you learned and how you continue to react. Now, the challenge that we all have is that when we're under stress, when you're in a lot of traffic and you're afraid of that guy behind you, when we're under stress, we tend to do what our personality tells us to do, not what that individuality that is connected to God. But we got to pay attention to it. So when it happens to you, when you get home or at some other point in time, you can say, wow, that didn't go well. That didn't go how I expected it to go. And it's the same thing that goes on when somebody is in an improv skit. You get into the skit, things happen, and you have a conversation about what worked and what didn't work. So what Tina Fey told us, and we're not going to go through every one of these, is that the first thing is you got to agree. That's pretty hard. And it takes work to agree. But it doesn't mean that you have to like each other. And it doesn't mean that you have to agree on what the original fight began or how the original fight began. Any of you ever have an issue with your significant other? Maybe I'm the only one. But when that happens, when you have that issue with your significant other, and the next day or some hours later, you decide after you get through with all those reactions and all those chemicals that rush into your body, and you come in and the first thing you say is what? I love you. You really can't get to anything else until we can agree that we love each other, that we care about each other, that we're important to each other. And that agreement is what she's talking about. We don't have to agree that she was wrong. We don't have to agree that I'm wrong. The first step is that we agree on something that's a part of the relationship. That's where we go. That's where we go. And the only other one I want to make a point about is there are no mistakes, only opportunities. Now, there are some people who can't make mistakes. When I was a helicopter pilot, I couldn't make mistakes. But in my life, I make mistakes. When I speak about how to make up, that's because I've made mistakes. And then learning how to make up and how to apologize has been a big part of my growth. So when I seek to have a better life, I work on responding and reacting to situations based upon those 5 unity principles. That I've got a spark of divinity within me, and so do every one of you. And so does that guy in the truck. And that's where the choices begin for us. That's where the choices begin. Then you have the mistake, slam on the brakes and stuff happens. Then you decide the next time you'll do something different. That's why we call it practice. So we have to keep practicing, and we'll get better at improvisation.